Adjustment layers are a way for you to apply adjustments non-destructively to your photographs. This here shows a list of all of the adjustment layers that you have to work with. In this chapter, I'll be reviewing several of the adjustments you're most likely going to use for photographic editing. Here you can see that the adjustments that are in blue are the ones that I'm going to be showing you throughout this chapter. As you can tell, I won't be going through every single adjustment. Instead, I'll be showing you only those that I feel are most helpful when editing photographs. Let's jump over to Photoshop to see how adjustment layers work. I have Photoshop opened, and first I'm going to kind of review what I have set up here in the workspace. At the very top, I have the Adjustments panel open. Below that, I have the Properties panel. And then just below that is the Layers panel. These are the only three panels that I'll need to work with when applying adjustments to my photos. Adding an adjustment layer is as simple as clicking one of these options in the Adjustments panel. Simply click, and then if you look down in that Properties panel, you'll notice that it's changed a bit. The Properties panel is going to show you the properties of whichever layer you have selected. When you're working with adjustment layers, it's going to show that specific adjustment. Right now it's showing curves because I just added that to the Layers panel. If I were to add a second adjustment layer, if you notice down in the Layers panel, the photo filter adjustment is now highlighted and the properties have changed. If I go into that Layers panel and click on the Curves adjustment, it's going to show me the properties for that layer. I'm going to go ahead and just highlight these two layers and delete them so we can kind of start over and I can show you some other ways that you can actually apply an adjustment layer. In the Layers panel, if you click on that half black and white circle, you'll see a pop-up of several adjustment layers. So basically anything that's starting from that brightness and contrast all the way down, those are going to be the same adjustment layers that you see in that Adjustments panel. You can also add adjustment layers through the menu. If you go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, then you have all of those options here as well. I'm going to go ahead and add a black and white adjustment. And when I do that from the menu option, you get a pop-up that you don't see with those other options. You can make changes to this if you want, such as adding a clipping mask. You can even add a color to that layer. It doesn't actually affect your image. It's just a way for you to kind of organize your layers if you have a lot of them going on. You can even change the blend mode and the opacity from here. But these options are also available in the Layers panel, so you don't have to worry about this if you're adding through the menu. Just go ahead and click OK. Over in the Properties panel, there are some options here at the bottom. The eyeball is going to toggle the visibility of that adjustment. You can also go into the Layers panel and click that eyeball on the left, which does the exact same thing. There are a few here that are grayed out, and that's because they are not quite applicable yet, but I'm going to show you how they work, and I just kind of have to set it up a bit. So I've added this black and white adjustment. I'm just going to make a few changes to some of the sliders here, so it's a little bit different than the default settings. So I'll increase that red slider. I'll make the greens a touch darker, and I'll try to make that sky a little bit darker as well. Now I can toggle the visibility of that layer, and the other two options next to it have become active. This option with the eyeball and the little curvy arrow allows you to toggle the previous state. As I press and hold that and then release, you'll see that it's toggling what was the previous state of that adjustment. And in this case, it's just the basic black and white adjustment. So if you want to get a feel for the changes that you've made along the way, then that's a good option to use. Otherwise, you're stuck with just toggling the full before and after. And if you want your image to be black and white, for example, that's not really going to tell you and show you what's changed in the photo. Now, if I were to make more adjustments to this, I'll just increase the yellows there, and I go back to that toggle state, it's still bringing me back to that original black and white adjustment. So if you're kind of playing with an adjustment layer and you want to see what different settings do, so maybe you've applied some settings and then you want to make changes, but kind of go back to that previous state of adjustments, what you'll want to do is go to the Layers panel and then click on a different layer, then go back to that adjustment. Now you can make those edits. And if I go back to that toggling of that previous state, it's going to show me what it looked like just before I clicked off of that adjustment. You can also reset all of the adjustments. That just takes them all the way back to their default. And here I just had to click it twice just to kind of go backwards a few steps. And you can also delete the adjustment layer from the Properties panel as well, just by using that little trash icon. So I'll go ahead and click that, and now the adjustment layer is gone from my Layers panel. The brightness and contrast adjustment is a very straightforward tool to make simple changes to your photo. It's a great tool to use when you need to add just a really quick and simple adjustment without going into the weeds with the other tools. It's also a great tool to work with when you're still kind of getting used to some of the more complex tone adjustment tools. It's one that you'll probably work with for a little while and then eventually kind of work your way out of it by playing with other things such as curves, which I will be explaining in the next video. So let's go ahead and jump into Photoshop to see how the brightness and contrast adjustment works. I'll begin in Photoshop by going up to that Adjustments panel, and I'll click Brightness and Contrast. Down in the Layers panel, you'll notice that I have that new adjustment layer added, and the Properties panel has updated to show that new setting. To add brightness to your image, take that brightness slider and move it to the right. You can also darken the image as well if needed. At any time, if you'd like to reset a slider, and this goes for pretty much all of the adjustment sliders, go up to that slider and double-click it. That brings everything back to 0. You may also notice that there's a little hand icon with arrows on either side of it that lets you click, and then you can drag to the left or to the right. And this is a really good way to kind of just watch your photo while you're editing. The number in that brightness setting doesn't matter as much as what the actual image looks like while I'm making the adjustments. Just below that, we have the contrast slider. So you can reduce contrast if you'd like to do that. And you can see it does a nice kind of subtle job of reducing the contrast. You can also increase the contrast as well. I think this photo will look better with a little bit of a reduced contrast look. Let's go ahead and see what that looks like. I'll just toggle that preview icon at the very bottom of the Properties panel. There's also an option here to use Legacy, and you can play around with this if you like. It's basically just using an algorithm from an older version of Photoshop, and so they include that here. Once you click that button, it's going to reset the panel, so then you'd have to go back up and make those adjustments. But as you can see, it's not doing quite as good of a job. It's requiring you to add brightness and then also balance it with the contrast. But if you look in the photo, there's some areas that are really kind of bleached out and way too bright. Basically, it clipped the highlights, and it's noticeable more in the beak area and also some of the white in the feathers there. So I'm just going to reset this, and I'll just make those simple adjustments. Once again, I'm just going to take that brightness and move it to the right, and then reduce the contrast just a touch. And there's our final brightness and contrast adjustment to this image. When you want more control over your editing, specifically to the brightness and contrast of a photo, then the curves adjustment is where you'll want to start. At first glance, the curves adjustment might look a little daunting, but once you understand the mechanics of how it works, you'll have harnessed a huge amount of editing power in your photographs. Let's go ahead and walk through the settings that you can play with within the Curves tool. When you add the Curves tool, you will see an RGB curve, and this is what you'll use to adjust the brightness and the contrast in a photo. The way curves work is you click along that white line in the curve and you drag it up or you drag it down. Moving that up and kind of to that top left area will make your image brighter, and moving it to the bottom right area will make it darker. You can also adjust the shadows and the highlights by playing with that curve along those lines. And I'm going to show you how to do that once we jump over to Photoshop. So here are some examples of making your image brighter. As you can see on the left, that curve line was dragged upwards into that top left section, which adds brightness to the image. And then on the right, it was moved to the bottom right section, which makes the image darker. Along with editing the brightness and contrast in curves, you can also adjust the color. When you click that RGB dropdown, you have a red, a green, and a blue channel you can work with. We'll go ahead and start with the red. Moving that curve line up is going to add red, and moving it down is going to add cyan. You can also play with the highlights and shadows in the colors as well. And again, I'm going to show that once we jump into Photoshop. So here are those examples of using the red curve. Moving it up is going to add red to your image, and then moving it down is going to add cyan to your image. The green channel will add green or magenta to your image. So again, here are those examples. Moving it up, you're going to add green, and moving it down, you'll add magenta. And then lastly, we have the blue curve. So you can add blue or yellow. And then here are those examples for moving it up to add blue, and then moving it down to add yellow. Now let's jump over to Photoshop so you can really see how this works and get a better understanding of the mechanics of the curve tool. We'll go ahead and begin by adding a curves adjustment using that adjustments panel. I'll click the curves adjustment, and in the properties panel is where you'll make those adjustments to the curve. To actually adjust the curve, you simply click and drag, and you can just move it up and down if you like to actually see what it's doing to your photo. Now, adding brightness or darkness is not really the intention of the curves tool. Yes, you can obviously use it this way, but it's more likely that you'll want to do some more advanced type of editing. So I'm going to go ahead and reset that, and I'm going to show you a really common use of the curve tool, and that's adding brightness and contrast at the same time. The way I do this is I create what's called an S-curve, and you'll understand why it's called an S-curve as soon as you see it. So what you do is you go over to that curve and just kind of click somewhere in the top right quadrant and drag up. Then go down to the bottom left, click and drag down. And now if you look inside of that curve, you can see kind of a really subtle S shape. Now, of course, you can over-exaggerate it if you want to, and kind of the more exaggerated your S shape is, the more contrasty your photo will be. So I'm just going to backtrack real quickly, and let's create that really nice, simple, and subtle S curve. If I toggle this curve off and on, if you're watching that photo, you can see it adds a really nice touch of contrast to the image. Now let's talk a little bit about the highlights and the shadows. You can move and create points anywhere inside of this curve. So I could click in the middle here if I wanted to and make some adjustments there to kind of refine the way the curve looks. You can also play with the points on the very bottom left and the very top right. If I were to click that bottom left curve point and drag up, I'm adding some brightness to the shadows. And what that's doing is kind of giving it a matte effect. That was a little intense, so I'm just going to back off a touch. And I've just kind of faded the image a little bit. You can also do the same thing on the top right. You can add darkness to those highlights if you want to, and I'll just go pretty far down to kind of over-exaggerate it. You can also add some brightness to those, and you saw that when I kind of went a little too far over, it starts doing some really funky things to the curve. So if you are going to make some of these adjustments, oftentimes it's best to just do it really subtly. So I might want to drag that down just a touch to give a little bit more darkness into those highlights. And now let's toggle that off and on. And if you're watching that photo, you can see that this created a nice faded matte effect with a little bit of contrast. While still inside of the same curves adjustment, you can also adjust the color. So I'm going to take this RGB dropdown and go into red. The color on this image looks good, so I don't really need to make any color correction by playing with that kind of center line there, but what I would like to do instead is add a split toning effect. Now you saw me adjust the highlights and shadows with the RGB slider. You can also do that with the color sliders. So if I wanted to create a nice split tone effect, I can do it with the color adjustments. So I'm going to go to the bottom left of my image. I'm going to click. And we know that cyan is the color that's kind of in that bottom right triangle area. So if I take the shadow slider and I move it to the right, that's going to add cyan, but only in the shadow areas in my photo. Next, if I go to the top right, and this is the highlights section, if I wanted to add red to only the highlights, I would click and drag it along the top, and that's going to add a touch of red to the highlights, which gives it a nice split toning effect. You can jump into other colors as well, so maybe I'll go into the blue. And the top left quadrant here is going to add blue, and the bottom right is going to add yellow. Since I just added red to the highlights, maybe I want to kind of add a little bit of yellow to mix the colors a bit. So I'll go to the top right area, click, and drag down, and that's going to add some yellow to the highlights. Then I can accentuate the blues a little bit in the shadow. So I'll take that bottom left slider, click, and drag up. I don't want to go too far. That seemed to do a little bit too much, but that's going to add a touch of blue in those shadows. Let's go ahead and preview that before and after. So with that one adjustment layer, I was able to add contrast, a matte effect, as well as split toning. Curves is an extremely powerful tool. I highly encourage you to open up your photos and just play around with the settings. The more you play around with those shadows and highlights and the different RGB channels that you can work with, the more you'll really get to understand curves and the more you'll actually want to use them with your photographic editing. The Vibrance Adjustment layer helps to add or remove color intensity in your photograph. This adjustment has two sliders, Vibrance and Saturation. And you might be wondering, what's the difference between these two sliders? The basic difference between these sliders is that Vibrance is going to add, basically it's going to saturate your image, but it's not going to be as harsh or as intense on the red areas in a photo. Most skin tone has a lot of red in it, and so Vibrance is kind of a safer slider to use when editing photographs of people or anything with a lot of red in the scene. Saturation, on the other hand, is going to adjust all colors equally. I'm going to jump over to Photoshop now so you can really see the difference between these two sliders. I'll go ahead and add the Vibrance adjustment by clicking it in the Adjustments panel. And here are those two simple sliders that you can work with. If I take that Vibrance slider and move it around, I can push it all the way to the right, and it's really not doing a lot to overdo the photo. It is a little too colorful and a little too saturated, but I wouldn't say that it's completely overdone. You can also reduce the vibrance, and if you notice, if I go all the way to the left with that slider, it doesn't completely desaturate the photo. There's still a little bit of color left. I'm going to reset that slider. Now let's look at saturation. If I take saturation and push it all the way to the right, things start to look kind of funny, especially her skin tone and some of those bright reds and pinks in the scene. If I were to take this slider and move it all the way to the left, this actually does desaturate the photo, so it really is kind of affecting all colors equally. I'm going to go ahead and reset this, and to give you a better idea of the difference between these two, I'm going to start out first by taking that Vibrance slider and pushing it all the way to the right. Next, I'm going to go into my Layers panel, and I'm just going to click off of that Vibrance layer and then go back to it. And the reason I did that is because I want to be able to compare the two different editing states. And so if I kind of navigate or click away from that adjustment layer and go back to it, then it's going to remember that Vibrance setting that I just added. And I think you'll understand this a little bit more once I actually start showing you what I'm trying to achieve. So I'm going to go up to that Vibrance slider. I'm just going to double click the name, and that just resets the slider back to 0. Then I'll take that saturation slider and push it all the way to 100. Now inside of this Properties panel, I can go over to the Preview button that allows me to preview that previous state, which was the Vibrance at 100 and Saturation at 0. So if I click that, now this, what you're seeing right now, this is with a Vibrance setting of 100. This is with a saturation setting of 100. So you can really see how they vary and how the Vibrance slider is going to be a little bit more kind to certain colors, whereas saturation is just going to really, really overdo them. I'm just going to reset everything here and just do a really quick edit using these two sliders. So I'll take that Vibrance slider, and usually when I'm playing around with sliders, I like to push them all the way to the right. I like to kind of wiggle them around while I'm watching my photo. And then once I feel like it's in a good place, I'll release. Sometimes I'll toggle it off and on to just see what it changed, and that's looking pretty good. Now let's play with saturation. I might want to intensify it a little bit more and increase that saturation slider up. Another thing you can do is sometimes I like to really push that vibrance slider high, and then I'll take that saturation slider and actually go in the negative with it and kind of split them. There's just a lot of different ways that you can play around with these sliders. My advice is watch your colors, specifically the reds and the pinks. Make sure that they just don't get oversaturated. Sometimes if you zoom in real closely, you can see some funny lines starting to happen. And if I do that here, as I push it to the right, you can see some funny things happening in her shirt. It kind of just did some weird things up to the top. I lost a lot of detail in those areas. So I definitely wouldn't use this at a higher setting. And in fact, I often like to kind of reduce it just a touch in the negative when I'm playing around with both vibrance and saturation. The hue and saturation adjustment will give you a lot more control with the colors in your photo. You'll typically want to use this adjustment over the standard vibrance adjustment when you want to change specific color values and also change the hue in the colors. So hue stands for the color value, meaning you can change a red to a pink or a blue to a purple. Saturation is color intensity. And then lightness is color luminosity. So you can make a color either a little bit brighter or a little bit darker. Let's jump into Photoshop to see how this adjustment works. I'll go ahead and start out by going up to that adjustments panel and adding a hue and saturation adjustment. By default, you'll have the master setting, which basically means that all colors are going to be adjusted. So let's just walk through that real quickly to see how it looks. If we start at the top with the hue, I can click and drag it to the right or to the left, and it's shifting the colors in the entire image. You can go really extreme with it if you want, but pushing it really far is usually going to kind of do a little too much with those colors. I typically like to stay in kind of a small range here, just in the middle, when making adjustments to the hue. I'll go ahead and reset that. Now let's jump down to saturation. This is just like the example slider in the previous lesson. So you can increase it. If I push it all the way to the right, it's really doing some funny things. So saturation, you kind of want to be light-handed with. You can also desaturate your colors. And, if you push it all the way to the left, you remove all color completely from whichever colors you have selected. And then lightness is going to make those colors brighter or darker. And of course, because I have that master channel set, it's going to make the entire image brighter or darker, but not really in a very good way. Let's now go into making some selective color adjustments using this tool. So I'll take that drop down and I'm going to jump down to magentas. My hope is that the magenta's color range, which you can see here in the bottom, is going to affect that kind of pink wall. So I'll take the hue slider and I'm just going to kind of push it to the right. I'm just going to play around with it so you can really see what it's doing. And you can tell as I get into some of those areas, it's not really getting the entire wall. There's some funny little splotches of different colors there. So that's another reason why I kind of like to stay just in this kind of middle range here, kind of like the middle third of that hue slider. In this case, I'm going to push it to the right to kind of create a little bit more of a warm pink color. I'm also going to take that saturation slider and increase it to the right as well to add more color intensity to the wall. I'm going to play around with the lightness slider now to see what it does. So if I push it to the right, it just makes that pink wall a lot brighter. Moving it to the left makes it darker. I'm not really sure if I want to adjust the lightness of this, so I'm just going to reset it by double-clicking the lightness name there, and that slider goes back to 0. Now I'd like to switch gears and select a different color. So I'll go up to that drop-down, and I'm going to try to kind of get to the blue cyan color on the left, so I'll click cyans. So I'll go ahead and take that hue slider and move it to the right, and maybe to the left. And I'm just going to kind of stop when it kind of turns into that nice kind of light blue color. Then I'll take that saturation slider and I'll move it to the right to really intensify the blue in that wall. If you were to choose one of those colors from the drop-down, but it wasn't quite finding the color that you wanted, you can also play around with these eyedropper tools. This will actually let you choose a color in your image and then make adjustments once you kind of have that color selected. But you also want to make sure that you first choose the color that is closest to it in this drop-down. If I were to use the eyedropper tool immediately after making adjustments to another color area, it's actually going to take those adjustments and apply it to whatever color that I choose with the eyedropper tool. So for example, I just made adjustments to that blue wall on the left, and now I have that eyedropper highlighted. If I were to click on this door in the middle, it chose kind of like the reds in the photo, and it took whatever edits I made to the sliders to that blue wall on the left, and it applied it to the new color that I selected. So I'm going to undo that because I don't want to change the color of the door frame. I want to make sure that the edit remains to that blue or that cyan grouping over on the left side of the photo. The color balance adjustments helps you either correct or stylize color in your image. By default, you will be able to adjust the midtones, but you can change that tone drop-down to adjust either the highlights or the shadows as well. I like to use the color balance adjustment for split toning. It's really easy to do split toning with this adjustment. It also works great if you have, let's say, some old scans of negatives and you need to do some adjusting to the color to make it look a little bit more true to what it should be. Let's jump into Photoshop and take a look to see how this adjustment works. So here's an example of an old photograph. Let's use the color balance adjustment to kind of bring some of the original color back to this photo. In the Adjustments panel, I'm going to choose Color Balance and click on it once to add the adjustment to my Layers panel. Now in the Properties panel, you'll see that the tone is defaulted to midtones. For color adjustments, usually that's where I want to start, and then I can kind of go into the shadows and highlights if I want to play around with some other settings. So overall with this image, what I see is there's an overwhelming amount of green. In regards to color, it's a little too cool. So I'll take that magenta and green slider and I'm going to add magenta, which will remove some of that green color cast. So I'm just going to slide it to the left, and that's already off to a pretty good start. Now if I want to, I can go into the shadows and the highlights and see if there's anything else I can do. Now sometimes when you're playing with color, especially with color cast, it's not always easy to know exactly which color to add or to remove. But because it's an adjustment layer, you can easily play with those colors and go back and change them as much as you need to. So you can just kind of slide those sliders around. And then maybe when you start seeing something that looks like it starts to work, then you can stick with it. So maybe adding like a touch of blue kind of helps to bring back some of that original color. I'm going to take that tone drop down and go into highlights, and let's do the same thing. So I'll try increasing a bit of red there, and I'm going to go down to the yellows, and I think I'm going to try a touch of yellow to give that image a little more warmth. Let's toggle the before and after to see how that looks. And that looks like it does a really good job of bringing back some of that color and removing that color cast from that image scan. Let's jump into another photo. And for this image, I would like to add a split toning effect. So I'll go ahead and go up to the Adjustments panel, add a color balance adjustment. Now when I'm playing with split toning, I completely ignore the midtones and I only address the shadows and the highlights. So I'll start out with the shadows. And what I'd like to do here is add a nice classic teal and orange effect. And to do that, you want to make sure that you're mostly playing with the blues and greens, so mostly just the cool colors. So I'll take that cyan slider and I'll drag it to the left. I'll add a touch of green and a touch of blue. Next, I'm going to take the tone drop down and jump down to highlights, and I'm going to play with the opposite colors now. I'm going to go ahead and add some red. I'm going to skip down to yellow and add a touch of yellow to those highlights. Let's go ahead and toggle that off and on to see the result. It added a really nice teal and green split toning effect by basically just playing around with the shadows and the highlights and ignoring the midtones in that tone drop down. One last setting you'll see inside of this is the Preserve Luminosity box. Now, basically what this does is it makes sure that it keeps the original tone, like the contrast and the brightness in your photo, and it makes it so that the colors that you're adding don't alter that at all. I recommend that you leave this checked so you can kind of ignore it if you want to. But the beauty of playing around in Photoshop is that a lot of the time, experimenting with different sliders and checkboxes and tools is maybe going to help you find something that creates a look that you weren't expecting. So I recommend playing around with all the settings because you might find something that works really well with your images. Now let's go ahead and talk about the black and white adjustment. Adding a black and white adjustment is going to do so much more than simply desaturate your photo. You have all of these sliders that you can work with to add brightness and contrast to specific color ranges in the scene. Let's jump over to Photoshop and I'll show you how this adjustment works. I'll begin by adding the black and white adjustment in the Adjustments layer panel. Now right off the bat, it adds a very basic, kind of a desaturated default black and white look. If you'd like, you can kind of play around with these presets, and these are just going to have preset adjustments down here in the bottom. So it might be able to give you kind of a good starting place. I'm going to go ahead and reset this though, and let's play around with these sliders so we can actually see how they work. I usually start at the top and I usually go through all of the sliders and kind of play with them, moving them back and forth to see what colors are actually being affected. So I'm going to take that red slider and I'm going to push it to the right. And if I push it to the left, it makes that barn darker, but I would like the barn to be a little bit brighter. With photography, our eyes tend to gravitate towards the areas in the scene that are brighter and have more contrast. In this case, the barn is the subject here, so I want that to kind of be where the eyes are drawn in the photo. I'll jump down to yellows, and I'm just going to move it to the right and to the left, and I'll kind of stick with maybe a little bit brighter to the right. That's catching the barn as well as some of that grass in the foreground. I'll take that green slider and just move it back and forth. And it doesn't really look like it's doing very much. There's not a lot of actual greens in the image, so it kind of doesn't matter where that's set. I'll just go ahead and leave it where it landed there. I'm going to take the cyan slider and drag it to the left and the right. And I definitely want to make that background a little bit darker. It looks like some of the cyan is in the sky as well as in those mountains. And my guess is the blue is going to be the same, and it is. So moving that blue to the left also helped to kind of add more contrast and darkness to that sky. Lastly, let's play with the magentas, and it doesn't look like there's a lot of magenta color in there, so I can kind of just ignore that slider. But let's take a quick peek at the before and after of this from the base black and white adjustment to what I actually changed in the scene. So you can see there's quite a difference there, and the second one has a lot more interest in contrast. It's just a much more pleasing image. So you really want to make sure that you play around with those sliders inside of the black and white adjustment. We'll jump over to one other image just so you can kind of get another feel for how this works. I'll add that black and white adjustment layer in the top, and as soon as I did that, the image is just really, really flat. I've lost a lot of interest in this photo. It's a very simple and kind of minimalistic photo to begin with, but there's definitely color in it. I know that the color of the flower is yellow, so I'm first going to start out by taking that yellow slider and I'll drag it to the right. I don't want to go too far to the right or I start losing detail, so I just want it bright enough so it's brighter than the rest of the scene, but I still have detail in the petals. And then I'm just going to go through and play around with the other sliders. And sometimes they are making changes and sometimes they're not. For the most part, I'm going to want to move them to the left to make that background darker. So I'm just taking each slider and just dragging it to the left. Some of them aren't doing very much, but that's okay. And now let's get a feel for what this looked like from kind of that base, simple black and white adjustment to what we actually changed it to. And you can see how it really makes a huge difference when you play with those sliders. So I recommend just playing around with each of those sliders. You don't always know what colors are in your scene, especially when it's already converted to black and white. Of course, you can always toggle that back and forth if you really want to fine tune the color and the contrast in your photo so you actually know which parts of your scene you're adjusting with those sliders. The photo filter adjustment kind of mimics color filters that you would put on lenses back in the film days, and it just helps to add a color overlay to your photo, making it a little bit warmer or a little bit more cool. There's a few other options as well, and of course you can fully customize it if you'd like. It's just another way to colorize your photograph. Let's jump into Photoshop so you can see how this tool works. I'll go ahead and start by adding that photo filter adjustment in the Adjustments Layers panel. The default setting is a warming filter, and you can see that here in this filter dropdown. If I click this, I can go through and try a bunch of different options, and basically what it's doing is it is just changing that color you see here in this color swatch and adding that color to the image. Here you'll see a density slider, and it's set at 25%, so it's just adding a touch of color, but you can push it really far to the right or even reduce it down to the left a bit if you want to change the intensity of the photo filter on your image. So I'll bring it back up to about 25% there, and let's kind of see what some of these other ones are doing. So we have a sepia look, deep blue. There's just a bunch of different options here on this list. But if you know that you have a specific color that you want to work with, or you want to kind of change the color a little bit that it's set to, you can click on this color swatch and then choose your own color. And as I'm choosing a color, it is actually changing it in that preview image. It's pretty subtle because it's only at a 25% density, but it does allow you to kind of select a color. So here I'll just select a brown, which is kind of going to add a sepia look. And then if I were to increase the density there, I kind of just desaturate it and add a little bit of a color effect to the photo by doing that. This adjustment is just one other way to add color to your image. There are a lot of ways to do any given thing in Photoshop, and the photo filter is a quick way if you're looking at your photo and you think maybe it needs a touch of warmth, or maybe it needs to be cooled down just a bit, or you'd like to add that cool or warm effect to your photo. It's a really quick way to go ahead and do that. Let's talk about the color lookup adjustment. The color lookup adjustment allows you to add LUT files, which are actually cube files, to your images. So if you're familiar with LUT files, this is how you actually will use them inside of Photoshop. LUT stands for lookup table. That's why it's called the color lookup adjustment. If you notice here in this graphic in the properties panel, there's a lot going on, but this top dropdown, the 3D LUT file dropdown, is really the only one that you have to worry about when working with LUTs. There are some Adobe defaults that you can kind of play around with, and you can also use your own if you have some that you've either created or that you've purchased or downloaded from the internet. Adobe does have default LUTs that you can play with, and those are in this dropdown. But if you have your own cube files, your own LUT files, or maybe they're ones you've created, or they're ones that you've purchased or downloaded, you can use those here inside of the color lookup adjustment. Let's jump over to Photoshop and play around with this tool to see how it works. I'll start by adding the color lookup adjustment over in the Adjustments panel. Once I've added it, I actually need to choose a setting in order to see some results. So here inside of the Properties panel, I'm going to click that drop down, and I'll go ahead and just select one of these from the list. After you've done that, there really aren't any other settings that you'll want to play with. The only thing you may want to do is go into the Layers panel and play around with the opacity setting. This will basically just kind of reduce the intensity of the LUT effect. Some of them are going to be a little more intense than you might want for your image, so that's a good way to kind of play around and really kind of fine-tune that adjustment. If you'd like to add your own LUT file, go back up to that drop-down and then click Load 3D LUT from the top. Navigate to where you have your cube files stored. I have my folder already open here, so I'll go ahead and click one and then select Open, and that applies it to the image. And I can actually see it there in that dropdown. Again, I'll probably want to use the opacity setting to reduce the intensity of that effect. And let's see what that looks like. The gradient map adjustment is a really fun way to colorize your photo. The way it works is it takes a gradient and it applies different colors to the highlights, midtones, and shadows. Basically, it maps those colors depending on how the gradient is created. So for this example, if you take a look at that gradient at the top, it has pretty much a black on the left, it has some grays and a little bit of sepia in the middle, and then it has white on the far right. So it takes the black coloring and it applies that to the shadow areas. The middle portion of that gradient is going to be applied to the midtones, and the far right portion is going to be applied to the highlights. This is a pretty standard and kind of normal looking gradient. Let's jump over to Photoshop and I'll show you a few other examples so you can really get a feel for how this tool works. Before I start playing with the gradient map adjustment, first I want to make sure that you have a certain set of gradients inside of your gradients tool. I'm going to jump up to Window and then go down to Gradients. This is where all of the gradients will live, and you'll access these same gradients inside of the gradient map adjustment. So all the gradients inside of Photoshop are basically synced. Whatever you do inside of the gradients panel will actually show up in other gradient tools and vice versa. Inside of the gradients panel, I'm going to click the drop down on the top right. Then I'm going to go down to Legacy Gradients. I'll make my panel a little bit bigger here. And I'm going to expand the Legacy Gradients. And if we scroll down, we'll find this set of gradients called photographic toning. I find this to be the most useful set of gradients when editing photographs. Some of the other gradients are kind of fun when you're doing design work, but we're photographers and we probably want things that are going to look a little bit more realistic and kind of grounded to photographs instead of some crazy wild colors. So now that we have that photographic toning set inside of the gradients panel, I can go ahead and close the gradients panel, and now we can go ahead and add the gradient map adjustment. So I'll head over to the adjustments panel and I'll click gradient map. Now by default, it created a black and white gradient. When you add a gradient map, you might end up with different colors, but that's okay. You don't have to worry about what happens when you first add it. I'm going to go ahead and click once inside of that gradient, and now I have a gradient editor. Take this over and move it to the side so we can really see our photo at the same time. Let's just kind of play around. Before I add some of those photographic toning adjustments, first I'd like to show you what some of the other color gradients will do. So I'll start out in the purple section, and I'll go ahead and click on one of these. Now if you look at the gradient on the bottom, on the far left is like a cyan blue color, and on the far right is a magenta pink. And you can see how those colors are kind of mapping to the different tones in the image. I'll go ahead and click through some of the other ones so you can get a feel on how kind of wild and crazy you can make your photo look when you're playing with the gradient editor. But let's scroll down and go into those legacy gradients. I'm going to access the photographic toning. And now I have some that are a little bit more realistic for my photograph. So here's a nice teal orange color. You can give it more of a black and white or sepia effect. Kind of a bluish color, a cyanotype, copper. There's a lot of different options in here. Now, as I'm clicking through these, I'm also noticing the gradient at the bottom is changing. If you want to have specific colors in your gradient, you can do that as well. So I'll go ahead and click one of these just to have a starting place. And I'll go ahead and click this kind of teal color at the bottom. Now I see the color swatch popped up there. I can click that and change it. Maybe I want to have a darker blue, so I'll change it to a darker blue. And then you can just keep going through each of those color stops and making adjustments. And the nice thing is you actually get to see that preview change while you're working on it. I'm actually going to cancel that one there, and I'll go ahead and just leave this setting as is and click OK. So the gradient map tool is just yet another way to add a colorized effect to your photographs.